Today's PACE seminar on driving improvement in California's continuation high schools. We're really fortunate today to have two people who really need no introduction, but I'll introduce them briefly anyway. The two authors of the report that's being talked about, which is on the table in the back, are Milbrey McLaughlin, who is an emeritus professor at Stanford and the founding director of the John W. Gardner Center for Youth and Their Communities. And the other speaker is Jorge Ruiz de Velasco, who is the education director at the Chief Justice Earl Warren Center on Law and Social Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. They're going to talk today about continuation high schools, which are, as probably all of you in this room know, a neglected subject in California education policy conversations. Despite the fact that they enroll as many as 10% of all high school students in California, they really are rarely on the radar. And I think Milbrey and Jorge have done yeoman work in trying to get people to pay closer attention and think about how those schools can be improved. So with that, I will hand it over to Jorge and Milbrey.
Thanks, David. I'm going to start with sort of a little bit of a caveat in that a lot of our work, it's been a two-phase process. We've been at it as a multi-year project that we started in 2007, actually. And we were actually, Milbrey and I were here in 2010 talking about our phase one reports, which I'm going to reprise very briefly before we talk about our more recent work looking at higher performing continuation high schools. But what's really impressed us in the last 8 to 10 months is how much the ground has shifted in the education space for all of you. I mean, with the Federal Department of Ed looking to create greater flexibility in its funding flows, to shake up the accountability system through a waiver process because Congress is broken, with folks here in Sacramento rethinking our entire accountability system, foreshadowing the implementation of the Common Core, with so many superintendents trying innovative things that touch on this very population, working on full-service community schools in Oakland, working on efforts to do more small learning communities in comprehensive high schools. So the ground has shifted a great deal with a lot of opportunities for the work that we were going to describe. So with that in mind, I just wanted to figure that a lot of the recommendations that you see in our written report were printed up last spring. And since that time, we've moderated a little bit as we sort of try to surf the events in education, and we'll try to sort of elucidate, we'll try to sort of cast some light on what those opportunities are as we go along. So as I was saying, we did a two-phase study. In the first phase, what we tried to do was we tried to figure out whether there was something called a typical continuation high school that we could describe. We visited 9 counties, all the way from Humboldt in the north to San Bernardino, Riverside, and San Diego in the south, and San Joaquin and Fresno in the Central Valley. Altogether, we visited 26 school districts and 37 continuation high schools, which pretty much is about 10% of all the continuation high schools out there. So we got a very solid sample and a really good look. We wanted to know, what is a continuation high school? Who are the students in those schools? How are they staffed and supported? And what can we learn from them that policymakers can really sort of leverage? One of the things we found was enormous variation. So we started out looking for the typical continuation high school, and we couldn't find one. And that's because, and a lot of people say, well, there's a lot of variation in the high school space anyway. And that is true. I think in a large system, you will see a great deal of variation, and variation by design across geographies and different kinds of population. But because by design also, those schools sit within a common accountability system, even when you see variations in outcomes, you tend to see modes on the design side, on the intervention side, as schools start to gear their interventions and their work to the demands of a common accountability system. We didn't really find this in continuation high schools. And so a lot of the work that we did subsequent to that first phase was to sort of go after the question of why, what is it about these schools that there is so much variation. One candidate really was that the schools live in a sort of a historical place that hasn't caught up with change even in a stronger way than comprehensive high schools. The continuation high school was born in the sort of pre-1950s agrarian phase in California, and so they are designed in many ways to meet the needs of kids who were going to be working part-time. And so part of that design was a half day of instruction to allow kids another half day early release to work. Over the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the legislature tightened some of the language around the continuation high school to articulate that they wanted the continuation high schools to have a clear vocational purpose and curriculum, a curricular pathway implicitly for students who were not going to be going to college. And that was true up until the advent of the accountability system that was put into place in 1999, 2000 with No Child Left Behind. And at that time, without actually taking out any of the legislative intent language, the legislature just added on that the purpose of the continuation high school was to provide an alternative route to the standard high school diploma, which was very different from its description in other parts of the legislation that authorized them. So you can see it's sort of an accretion of language in the authorizing legislation without any clarification of where this sort of sits in the education world. There's also other competing statutory language. Initially, continuation high schools were strictly a voluntary placement for kids who were either working or also who were credit deficient. And with the rise in suspensions and expulsions, and with the enormous pressure for schools to provide alternative placements for kids, districts that did not want to or did not have or could not afford a community day school, or who did not want to refer their kids out to county community day schools, sought and received permission from the legislature to do allow involuntary placement of suspended, expelled kids or SARB referred kids into continuation high schools. And so many continuation high schools receive both kinds of students. The other thing that we found in the first phase that was really a driver was what we call a really opaque or non-existent identification and placement system. So if you think about how we deal with kids who are identified as having a learning disability or kids who are identified as English language learners, there are very clear parameters for the identification, placement, induction, assessment, and exit of kids in those sectors. There's nothing like that for kids into, through, and out of alternative ed. Even where we found in the second phase schools that were outperforming others, that were doing really well, it was really the rare school, maybe one or two of all those that visited, where we sought as an artifact and asked, do you have a written policy that we can just take with us and put into our research pile? And we just didn't find any schools that had them. It was basically just an understood arrangement between the principals at the sending schools or the counselors Sometimes there was an unwritten district policy around the priorities, but there was never a written policy that parents could see, that students could see, that would guide counselors across schools. And so this sort of exacerbated the distribution of variation across schools. And of course, the funding system. Because the state reimburses districts for a half day only of instruction in continuation schools, but most districts recognize that none of their kids are working. Many districts, and most of the districts that we looked at in the second phase that were offering higher performing schools, were offering a full day of instruction using different kinds of methods. But this only sort of exacerbates the inequality across schools, as some districts are able and willing to do it, and other districts are neither able or willing to do that. We found that we were dealing with a really vulnerable population. So schools that were originally designed to work with kids in a flexible way who needed to continue their education because they were working, were now the place where we found kids who 3 to 4 times more likely than kids in traditional comprehensive schools were likely to be homeless, to be in foster care, to be in informal kinship care, in the case of many Latino youth in the Central Valley, sexually or physically abused by self-reports from the Healthy Kids Survey, to be parenting or pregnant, to be formerly incarcerated, to have gang involvement. And in many of the schools, although there's very scant data that's available statewide, when we did our site visits and looked at the reported LEP status of youth in many of our schools, we found the majority of our schools, especially in the Central Valley and Inland Empire, were enrolling as many as 20 to 30% of their students identified as English language learners and deficient credit because of that. And of course, it's not up on this slide, but it's a really racially isolated segment of the school population. We looked recently at trend data across the 10 years, and across the 10 years, the number of Black and Latino youth who are enrolled in these schools has gone from about hovering between 48, 52%, to the most recent enrollment is now a little bit over 66%. So 2 out of every 3 youth in these schools are Black or Latino youth, and that exceeds the statewide enrollment populations in a significant way. So it's not fully explained by the growth of those populations in the schools. So an important point before we move to this is that at the end of phase 1, what we did find was that there were many effective continuation high schools, and our attention was drawn to what is it about that we can learn from. Obviously, most kids by design in these schools are doing less well than others on virtually every state assessed measure, but that's by design because when kids are falling behind, these are the schools that they're put in. So that was not a surprise. What we did find, though, is that on average, when we compared cohorts of youth who had failed the KC in comprehensive schools and those who had initially failed the KC and were retaking it in continuation high schools, on average, the continuation high schools were doing just as well, if not better, than comprehensive schools at helping retakers eventually pass the KC. And we also found that on a range of, again, looking at similar students in both kinds of schools, that on a range of persistence variables like completion rates and school engagement measures like attendance rates, many continuation high schools were able to retain and graduate their students at a higher rate than similarly situated students in comprehensive schools. So, in phase 2, So what are the correct? We went back to about a third of the schools that we had originally visited, to 3 of the counties, and to a number of the schools in those counties in south and north part of the state that we found to either be identified as model schools, were doing better than the average in their rates of AYP, in their certification, WAS certification, and also 2 years running doing well or improving on their API scores. And wanted to know what specifically we could learn from these schools for state and local policy. So, am I going the right way? Oh, there. So, it was clear that in an environment where there was a weak accountability system that didn't apply to these schools, first because it bears mentioning that the common accountability system doesn't really drive instruction in this aspect of schools because the system really looks at performance on the API system looks at performance on standard assessments for which these students are already far below the basic line. So because all of the students are there, it's not very likely that a school is going to be able to move all of those above the proficiency line, which is what gets you rewarded in that system. So that alone, as a system, was not an accountability system that was going to energize and move instruction in those schools. The ASAM, or the Alternative School Accountability System, which was originally meant to be paired with the accountability system, but which had to be severed when No Child Left Behind came back and told the state that they couldn't have an alternative system, even one that was paired. They had to have one system for all students. You had another set of system that was measuring indicators that were very important for continuation high schools, their graduation rates, their persistence rates, their attendance rates, their credit accumulation rates, but those were not being rewarded in a common accountability system, and it was a system that was by and large voluntary. 20% of schools weren't even participating in that system. So they're operating in a weak system, and that meant that those schools that made traction simply had leaders that attended to setting goals and clarifying those goals. So, not surprisingly then, an important takeaway is that an important contribution the state can make in bringing a greater steady state of improvement to the sector is to clarify and strengthen, now that we have an opportunity to look again at the accountability system and make sure that it begins to measure performance and that it begins to measure continuous improvement over time in ways that matter to all schools in the segment, including the alternative schools. There were also the question of the involuntary transfer of students into schools that are intended for kids who are credit deficient. Over time, we've talked with a lot of our friends who are working in the schools, and it's initially our thought was, well, you know, if you design a school that is for credit deficient kids, this is a very different population from kids who've been dismissed from school because they brought a gun or because they're gang involved. And so to create a common school that has both kinds of populations, but it is not resourced to do that, creates a very untenable environment for teachers. What we've learned, what we continue to learn, is that sometimes those young people are the same population. They are credit deficient because they're experiencing challenges in school. They are not being well served in the common environment, and so there is an overlap. And so the insight there was that there may not be a hard and fast rule about placement. But what was important was that schools have articulated a transparent system for identifying who should get sent to a continuation school, how they will be placed there, how they will be inducted to be successful in those schools, and how we design the intervention at those schools to meet the kids for whom that placement and identification system directs. And that may look different across districts, but by having a system that is more transparent and requiring districts to make those placement decisions transparent, it provides a better atmosphere and platform for accountability. Higher performing schools also hold their they reward their teachers for using data to use proficiency-based growth over time, which is a point I just made. And it is something that where state policy is already moving in that direction. And it was an important insight, as well as they were looking very carefully at their data around graduation and performance. But their graduation rates often didn't coincide with a 4-year graduation rate system. So they were looking at how many of our kids are finishing in 4 years or 5 years, if they had the opportunity to keep them. They were looking at where they were also running GED programs, successful transition into GED, and then successful transitions to other education or workplace programs. So this implies that in this sector, it's very important to look at a 5 or 6 year graduation rate, particularly in those schools that enroll a large number of English language learners whose sort of growth trajectory has been sort of shaped by their inability to engage the curriculum because they're doing it in a second language. I'm going to hand it over to Nobri at this point.
Good.
Carry on.
Carry on. We noticed we wore the same outfit today.
I know.
Data-driven. Okay. Good morning. Glad to see you all. So I'm going to pick up some more on some of the state policy issues, as well as some of the lessons and suggestions that are suggested for districts. As Jorge mentioned, the high-functioning schools were also very data-sensitive and data-rich. Ironically, most of them had to generate their own data because the district data largely was either missing or absent for this population. So one of our recommendations for the state is to really strengthen and invest in CalPADS. And I'm looking at Alice and Bart over there, who have wonderful ideas about a save rate, which really depends on good CalPADS data. As many of you know, often is it in October the seedbeds comes and does their count. We found many instances in districts where the comprehensive high school, you probably already know this, would hold on to their kids until the seedbeds count has been made and then ship them off to continuation high school, never changing their roles. So there's sort of double counting going on here. But strengthening the CalPADS and looking into district administrative data would be just a huge, huge, huge help for continuation schools. And it also would help follow these kids. Any of you who are district people know how hard it is to say somebody dropped out, or if they moved to Alameda, or are they in another district. Without a CalPADS, you really don't know. The second recommendation we have is a little bit larger. It's supporting cross-agency integration of data. As Jorge mentioned, the kids who go to continuation high school are a super vulnerable population. They're in foster care, they're system kids, they have health issues. What we found in San Mateo County, working with integrated data, is that schools really can begin to see what the institutional footprint is of these kids, looking across institutions. Not identified at the individual level, but rather at the aggregate level. But where are our kids coming from? One of our districts, for example, a continuation school, had no idea of the number of foster care kids who were in their school. And based on that information, they were then able to form new partnerships with social service agencies and such. But absent that data, you really don't know, especially given the churn. Another recommendation that we think would contribute to high-performing schools, and that we saw formally in high-performing schools, is real attention to social-emotional learning. I know that non-cognitive or soft skills, whatever they're called now, has now become part of the conversation. But arguably, this is the most important set of indicators, in addition to the continuous performance Jorge mentioned, for a continuation school population. It's the issues of persistence, of belonging, of connectedness. And I think many educators would argue that unless those skills and attitudes are in place, it's very difficult to push an academic cookie uphill. Equity issues are enormous among the continuation high school population, and there really are important issues here for state policy. Jorge mentioned the history of continuation schools. In fact, it was San Diego fishermen who first kind of pushed continuation high schools into the state so their kids could go out on the boats in the afternoon to fish. This really isn't the issue driving continuation high schools anymore in 2013. There's a bill, AB 570, Jones Sawyer, that is about to, or Catellus, come before the legislature that will require a full day for kids. It's inequitable that this population only gets half a day of support. I mentioned this to Mike Kirst about 3 or 4 months ago. He had no idea. He had no idea that there wasn't a full day of support for these kids. So the really kind of innovative, aggressive continuation folks, well, Alice can tell you, scurry around. They put together adult education, they put together higher ed, they put ROP to make a full day. But it was at the district support, not the state support. Huge demand supply issues. Jorge and I are quite clear that there's a higher demand than there is opportunity for this population. We've worked closely with San Jose, for example, and the estimate there is 25% of their kids could use an alternative setting in terms of supporting their own success. And what we heard, especially in the Central Valley with real resource constraints, was a kind of triage that happened. So I have 90 kids in my high school who could benefit, but I can only send 60, so I got to figure out which of the ones I'm going to send. This is an equity issue. I think the state could address. What's the demand? How can we promote a better supply? Another artifact that has no logic at all, it's back to the San Diego fishermen, is a 16-year-old, you have to be 16 to enroll, right? In comprehensive continuation high school. Well, certainly the problem that leads a kid to continuation high school starts well before 16. And that's almost a no-brainer. And some districts have been innovative in putting together freshman academies or working in the middle school, but it's all been kind of spit and baling wire put together. There's no state support for this. So another recommendation that we think has kind of equity beat to it is to lower the enrollment age. I mean, 16 is when a kid can go off and work. It doesn't make any, there's no logic to that in the current system. More on accountability. It's almost impossible to be a high-performing continuation high school if you're in a district that doesn't see you, it doesn't acknowledge you, and doesn't hold you accountable. In every district, or in every instance where we saw a really strong continuation high school, they were in a district where there was explicit and active district support, and district held the schools accountable for student opportunities as well as student outcomes. Jorge mentioned the issues of a transparent placement policy. But in addition to that, in many instances, there's this credit misalignment that was well-intentioned, just like ASAM was well-intentioned. Many continuation high schools will award credit on kind of a ratchet system. So rather than going through a whole semester of math and getting an F, you can get a grade every 2 weeks, so you don't. If your next 2 weeks is not successful, you still don't lose the 2 weeks in which you were successful. Now that makes sense from the point of view of scaffolding and structuring positive experiences for students, but it's catch-22 for the student, because the student then goes back often to the comprehensive high school and the credits don't follow him or her. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't in that system. Isn't that an issue the policy should consider in terms of this credit alignment? And then related to that is tracking the students into and out of continuation high schools. The thing that Jorge and I are both data wonky kind of people, and we were stunned, just stunned, at the lack of available data on this population. And we would argue that the state data that are available are inaccurate. They're probably an undercount of kids, and there's just no tracking of where these kids go. So if you're thinking about the contribution of an alternative system, right now we really don't know. We can't say where do they go. Do they go back to comprehensive high schools? Do they go to community college? Do they go in the military? Where do they go? And I think until we can tell that story, it's a difficult policy sell. We heard versions of I feel like the Lone Ranger, I feel like the red-haired stepchild, all sorts of comments from folks in the alternative system, Elsa's smiling, about how disenfranchised they felt in their local system, how they just weren't seen at all as being educators, that had any status in the system. The kids themselves often talked about themselves as throwaway kids. Districts that supported teachers and administrators were typical in the high-performing schools. They had professional development that really focused on the needs they had. How do you work with foster kids? How do you work with kids who are English language learners? How do you work with homeless kids? So districts offering focused professional development is an essential issue. In many districts, in our phase 1 study, we found that just as some kids were warehoused in continuation schools, so were administrators and teachers. We found a number of instances in which the principal of a continuation school was really a principal in training for a comprehensive high school. Districts could do well to provide incentives and intention to who is in their continuation high schools and what kind of supports they have. Recruiting the kinds of principals and teachers who are effective with this population. Similarly, really including continuation educators in the district-wide conversation. I mean, many of them felt they weren't part of the conversation at all, and that there was their kids and our kids, as opposed to the district's kids. So continuing that conversation district-wide. And we thought a lot about the verb on this last recommendation, because for this audience, I would never want to say require. But this was such a huge issue, we went ahead with require. There are many comprehensive high school guidance counselors and principals who've never even been to the continuation high school. They've never seen it. And this is the case often when they're just across a parking lot and they haven't been in it. So if you're talking about credit alignment, if you're talking about kind of curriculum alignment, if you're talking about placements that make sense for a young person, it seems to us, that communication should be required between the comprehensive, the sending system, and the continuation high school. In every instance where we saw good communication, it was at the initiative of the continuation high school principal, who would make a point to go visit and talk about curriculum, talk about what his kids were doing, et cetera. So that would be something that, I don't know if that's state or local, but I think it should be required. The good schools were asset-based. There's a reason why these kids didn't do well in comprehensive high schools. A lot of it had to do with where they sat, their sense of themselves as students. We were really struck by the positive student learning climate and the student-focused learning in the strong continuation schools. But a lot of the schools didn't really know what to do about that. So that would be something both states and locals could address about guidance, how to provide a student-focused school climate. The discipline systems in the strong performing schools were very clear. Everybody understood them, and they really took a restorative model. I mean, it wasn't punitive. It was, how can we begin to address issues and provide you supports? So kids felt comfortable in that setting. And again, they all incorporated strategies with social emotional learning. It was an embedded curriculum. Almost in every class or in every interaction we saw, there was support for taking leadership, for persisting, for connecting, for belonging. It was just part of the fabric of the school. And finally, the successful schools attended to social supports as much as for academic supports. And here's some thoughts we have about what we've seen and how that might happen. Jorge mentioned that LA County has a linked learning initiative. why can't continuation high schools be part of that, with the extended and after-school time? We mentioned community service because it was a theme in the successful schools we saw. They made a really intentional effort to link their kids up with public service, community service, and that seemed to have two values. First of all, the kids felt like they belonged, they mattered, they were valuable. But also, community members got to see these kids weren't thugs, they were good kids. They really had something to contribute. So it both changed the community view of who goes to a continuation school, as well as the kids themselves about their own social value. We saw many partnerships that involved the cross the agencies, but most of them were asking forgiveness and not permission. I mean, they were sort of deals struck in a back room. But the effective continuation school looked a lot like a community school in terms of mental health services, in terms of social services, in terms of adult services, co-located on the campus. So districts and states, and the state, I think, could do well to provide incentives and waivers. Let people innovate with what's available in their locality. And then finally, the connections with higher ed, and we should hear from Els about, you know, first in the country. First rural, to do this kind of higher ed connection. Again, the motivation here was to make kids comfortable with a higher ed setting. Middle college, dual credit enrollment kind of things were part of the environment, here. So with that, I will stop, and we're happy to take questions. Thank you.
As far as funding levels, did you find that the school sites that you visited were below state average funding or above for the per pupil funding?
For the half day?
Yes.
That was at the ADA level. But it didn't cover what they needed. I mean, it didn't. So I used to talk about it as education by zip code. It really depended if you had a district or an administrator who was going to go out and hustle and support this extra. So they brought in extra funds, but it was through partnerships with higher education, it was partnerships with adult ed. But the ADA for the half day was the same as the district.
Now, were they eligible to receive the categorical grants, for target instructional improvement grants?
No, they don't get the CATs. And that's apparently, that's one reason why it hasn't come before the state board, actually, because there's no categorical oversight for continuation high schools.
Yeah, there used to be category pupil retention block grant. It was a continuation school add-on to the revenue limit. That those all got collapsed and are currently under flexibility. So she's right. There was at one time and there isn't anymore.
So, on the funding side, what we saw were generally two strategies. Either the school would run two programs, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, but it would be permissive in letting students cross over, so it allowed for extended time. They got credit for the same number of hours per day, but they could extend the hours across the day and do some independent study. That was one pretty favored strategy. The other one was, to run an independent study or to pair co-locate an adult ed program and also allow cross enrollment there. That was another way. What we did hear from a lot of schools, because we were doing this in 2007, 2008, just as the sort of crisis was sort of hitting in funding, and a lot of principals were saying that they were getting the same ADA per student, but their teacher-student ratios were much smaller because teachers were working with kids who were multi-grade, and many of them performing at grades even below the grades represented in their classroom. So it was a real challenge for teachers, and they were getting pressured from their central offices to grow their class sizes so that their ADA so that they wouldn't have to supplement, because they were having trouble explaining to their boards, well, why is this school costing more? and it's costing more because our teacher-student ratio is smaller. And those were the kinds of pressures they were under at the time because of the system.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more. First of all, I find your research really inspiring because I feel like there is a public connotation to continuation of high school that is pretty negative. And it sounds like you still found a little bit of that attitude in your isolation. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the features of the higher performing schools in terms of the level of transparency of their students. In other words, I felt like there was a conflation of continuation and alternative education being presented, which I don't think is a bad thing. But were the students, what does success mean for those schools? Is it to transition back into the comprehensive high school, or is it to be able to offer an alternative and graduate from that continuation?
The successful schools, interestingly, even though the kids may have intended to transition back, they tended to hold on to them. But you raised an important issue around churn. Can you imagine having kids come in your classroom every week that you've never seen before? And Jorge mentioned the clear goals and the transparency. The administrators in successful schools had really clear rules about this. Maybe you can say more, Alice, about this is the mission of the school, these are our intake times, and this is what you do. So the curriculum was looped in a way that one could pick up, but a clear understanding that you can't just kind of move in and out of the school.
Yeah, it was hard to separate analytically identification and placement from success. Because we did visit schools where, successful schools, where the principal said, my goal is to help these kids transition back. But when you actually looked at their identification and placement policies, they were only admitting kids to the school who were a certain number of credits behind and who they knew that within 6 to 8 months, they could get them caught up and back. So that was a success, but it was rooted in a program that was designed around who they were admitting. The typical continuation successful school, they really saw their school as a destination point for their students. And they said, we're taking you, but we're going to shepherd you all the way to the diploma, and we're going to be your alternative setting from here on out.
And that was part of the student-centered, and again, the social-emotional learning. One other thing Jorge and I think is important from a policy point of view, and granted it's not realistic for a rural area, but many of the districts that paid most effective attention to this population had really a menu of alternative offerings, ranging from independent study all the way through a school that was really for previously adjudicated youth with. And in the middle was the continuation high school we were seeing. So in that district instance, an educator really could be very intentional about mission and about intake.
You know, in the case of the school that had a very narrow band of kids who they would admit, who were just a certain number of credits behind, we remember asking the counselor, well, then that means that you have a whole band of students below that. What are their options? And they go, we know they're going to drop out, and we're just waiting for
That's
them.
the triage. We don't have anything for them.
Hi, I'm a principal at Continuation Montana High School in Berkeley.
Oh.
And because the 622 was the involuntary transfer, I'm real clear that students of color, specifically males, are going to be transferred to my school, even though Berkeley High is predominantly white school.
Mm-hmm.
I only see predominantly male, pretty much African Americans into my school, with all the volatility that you listed in your PowerPoint. The issue is, in order to maintain staff, I have to have a population of students that merit maintaining staff, or I will reduce my staff. So you have to look at the fact that they're coming to you, and they have different pathways that they're going. I do have students who are able to get credit sufficient and transfer back. And I have students who are credit sufficient but don't want to transfer back.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have students who are nowhere near completion of their the credit degrees that they need. I transfer them to the adult school after age 18 if they finish the senior year with me already. So it's a matter of immediate, well, you're coming in, what can I offer you?
Mhm.
But you're right, the city and the mindset around the school and the community is it's a throwaway place. Just keep them from killing each other
Right.
and keep them off our campus.
How-
It's really that spoken thing, because you're not noticing unless there's something wrong. And when you are in meetings and discussions about curriculum, it will be, let's talk about the high school they have, which is Bergen High, and they'll say, oh, yeah, VTech, yeah.
How involved are you by the district in actually deciding the placement, identification and placement policies at your school?
If they're voluntary,
Mhm.
then I have a lot of sway. In that I need them to at least be a fifth grade mastery, because we do have a rigorous curriculum and we have an all-day program. Because the teachers in Berkeley are full-time teachers. So I have the students from 8:30 to 3:30. So I need students who can handle that rigor. And they also have to be responsive to our intervention with the psychosocial piece. So I can work with the voluntary with some criteria before they're sent from the high school to our school. But when it comes to involuntary, I have absolutely no say, especially special education. So they'll just say to me, you're getting this particular student. I do give a little pushback with special ed because I do need them at least fifth grade. Or if they're going to get frustrated and they will not be successful, our teachers will be worn out. So I've had that experience. So I kind of stand there and push back on that. But overall, it's where the students of color, predominantly male, who misbehave. Oh, by the way, your credit division. So yeah, you get them. But you're not getting any psychosocial support. You have to find that on your own. So it's really challenging as a site administrator.
So, part of getting our heads around that problem is if somebody else in the room were to ask us, well, what percentage of kids are voluntary and involuntary placed in schools, and how different do those two populations, we wouldn't be able to answer. We haven't even begun to begin answering, because nowhere is that data collected, not by districts and not by the state, so we don't know. We don't know, as important as the problems you just put on the table are.
But what it raises for me, and something I meant to mention and didn't, is that the high-performing schools are in a position because of district support and such to be proactive. That's kind of what we meant about the asset-based and the student-centered and the social-emotional learning supports, as opposed to reactive, which is what you described in terms of having to deal with involuntary transfers and things.
We actually do have the psychosocial that was created under my administration. The high school has 8 mental health therapists. We had none. So I was able to go to community meetings and make a relationship with a mental health group that's now housed at our school site. And so we can look at it that way. And then I take my leadership team and we call ourselves an intervention support team. And we front load students that come with a lot of problems. I have 140 kids and I have 44 that are homeless. I have 25 that are foster. So we already know we need to front load intervention for the students and them to be successful. So we spend a majority of our day making sure that happens so that when they're in front of instruction, there's actually a place for them.
Else, did you say?
Well, I'm going to talk from 2 hats. One from a principal of 4 continuation high schools, and your research is so nicely put when it says if you've seen 1 continuation school, you've only seen 1. And so some exist so that they are going to acclimate back into the comp site and graduate from there. I can't encourage enough a WASP process in our larger schools. So one hat is access at options, where we look at best practices across the state. Our kids are invisible, and if we don't speak for them, no one will. And you said a key piece about relationships with the people in our district, in our community. We're rural, so instead of having district partnerships, we have county partnerships because we're so small. As far as the decisions that we make as principals, the 2 most important decisions that we make are the staff that we hire. They're on the front line with our kids, and they better believe that those kids can succeed. And the second one is what community support can we garner? Because we cram all this into 2 years of these unsuccessful years prior to us. when they graduate, we got to do something else. We have to hand them off somewhere. The scaffolding, the business partnerships, business professional ready, the postgraduate training. It's larger than just the 2 years, if we're lucky that we have them for 2 years because they're so transient. So we can never stop speaking for them, ever. As far as the CalPADs now, I'll hand this out. It's something that Barrett and I have both worked on for years. And it's not just about API, but it's measuring our schools by something called save rate. So when our kids come to our schools, there is a CalPADS enter code, transfer code 165 or 167. 165 is because they come to us because of some sort of court transfer situation. And 167 is more of a voluntary, or it could be a SAR placement. Then we look at the middle of 30-day continuous enrollment is what we suggest. What happened during that time, in 30 days continuous enrollment, because we know that ASAM used to be 90, and we lost track of kids with 90 days. Then, how do they transfer out, or what is determined as success? So everything above that line on the right-hand side, if they transferred back to the comp site, they got a diploma, they exited out, whatever that transfer is on the upper right-hand side of that form, versus underneath the line where it says a negative, where it's a dropout, they aged out, or they were expelled, or they didn't show up. They were registered to come to school, but they didn't show up. If you were to take the number on the top and divide it by the number on the bottom, you'll find a ratio. And for that save rate ratio, instead of looking at the negative, which is a dropout, which you know how people do the shell game with those in all our places in the state and across the country, you're looking at what's the ratio. So if I look at Bowman High School, who has a 95% graduation rate, they just graduated 219 seniors, and they have an 80% going rate of postgraduate enrollment. I can say, wow, their save rate is at 90%, ours is at 70%. I want to know what they're doing. And I want to know the obstacles that our kids come with. We cannot ignore drug and alcohol issues or violence in the home. And before you can engage the brain, you've got to be able to address those issues. And I can't say it any other way. We owe it to our kids. There's nothing less than that. So, sorry.
Well,
I'm passionate about it.
Just sort of to close the loop, right now we know the different parts of the state are rethinking the API and what will go into the calculations for the API. And part of these indicators could be part of that conversation. And so we hope, it's one of those places where there is a window right now, and it's an open window to have a conversation about what our next generation accountability system should look like and what kind of indicators would really drive improvement in a particular sector is really important. The other point Els made was that the second most important thing were the partnerships that she works on her own to build. One of the most important ones as we move through schools is partnership with the county health providers around both mental health, behavioral health, and health particularly for parenting youth. And if you look at the Healthy Kids Survey data, the kids in continuation school, in terms of the high sort of vulnerability rate they have in risk-taking behaviors and so on, look very similar to those kids who are in county community schools. The difference is the kids in county community schools have had antisocial behavior, and they have just been expressing their issues in a very different way. But those schools get their ADA, and then they get an additional sum for kids to serve kids in community day and county community day schools, on the assumption that those kids will need additional services. But what that really is saying is that given similar population, will only give you the additional services if you harm yourself or somebody else. And at that point, it's kind of too late in the system to provide these additional support services. We ought to really think about how we can really recognize who those kids are, what their needs are, and provide for their needs.
David, you're standing up with a very purposive look on your face.
No, my only purpose is to sort of encourage the audience to ask questions. So and if they don't, I will, then I'll. Are there additional questions for? Yeah, Senator.
There was a reference made earlier to the block grant funding. The governor has a proposal sort of moving towards less accountability or less categoricals at the state level. Does that raise concerns in your mind? And if so, are there cautionary notes or recommendations that you would make to ensure that there is greater visibility and attention paid to these kids in light of local points on local control?
Well, one is we've already seen what districts have done as the governor moved the additional funding for Community Day and County Day into the block grant, is that there's been a dramatic decline in the number of districts that operate Community Day schools and a corresponding increase in the number of counties that are running those schools. So but the enrollments have remained steady. So what we're seeing is a shift of the districts to the counties, of that population, of the kids who've expelled, in part as a response to the move of that extra money into the categoricals and flexibility. More than that, I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly what else is animating districts there, but more flexibility in an environment that has a very weak accountability system just can't be a good thing.
Yeah.
If you're going to block grant more of that money, and under the assumption that districts can do creative things, it has to be paired with some accountability for this sector to really drive attention to those schools. Otherwise, we can only guess what will happen.
Right. I mean, and it's at both state and local levels. I think we've talked about accountability at two levels. Weak accountability hardly captures it at the local level. So if you're going to have more flexibility, as Jorge says, along with it needs to come the accountability tools that let one judge success and the equity issues again. It shouldn't be that it really matters where you live in California in terms of the quality of supports you get, and it does now.
And so what are some of those accountability measures that you're going to have more flexibility, you need a stronger accountability?
Well, we've talked about some of them. I mean, one, CalPERS has to happen, so you can track the individual. Supports for the kind of value-added continuous growth within the continuation school. Jorge, you mentioned that. And
the continuous growth measures. Yeah. So right now, schools that are doing well are kind of ignored by the accountability system because they're doing well. Schools that are increasingly not meeting their AYP, API targets right at the line get a lot of attention. But all of these schools are so far below the line that they have no hope of actually moving in ways that will be rewarded by the accountability system. A continuous growth regime would reward every school at every level for moving their kids some. And that would create a different environment for them that principals say they would respond to.
Okay. I mean, some of the kids who come into continuation schools come in with a third grade reading level in 10th grade. And, it's sort of rewarding the teachers who move that kid from third grade to 7th grade, just with reading proficiency, but would still fall way below the AYP and API. The other issue is that kind of given the regulations or the parameters surrounding that system, many of the kids never feed in at all because they aren't there long enough. They aren't there for the 90 days or the 60 days that it takes to be counted. So we had some very bizarre situations in which we tried to sample, pick schools that on paper looked like they were amazingly successful, Well, it turned out it was a completely conflated AYP and API score because only 1 or 2 kids in the school were able to take it.
Right.
So we had schools that were in the ninth, the 90th percentile. What's with that? So what kind of accountability indicators could be in place that account for the population served by the schools?
Just one more follow-up question regarding transferring back in my particular environment. My school was not ATG accredited. It is now. The record goes back to 2007. And my question was, prior to my coming and getting it accredited, transferring back, those kids were taking the courses, but they had no value when they transferred back to the comprehensive high school. So my question is, in the continuation schools that you observed, are there ATG accredited?
No. And what they've done is, for example, the PLUS schools in San Jose, they will allow kids to take some of the A to G courses in the comprehensive high school and move back and forth. But the A to G issue is huge. The credit alignment issue is huge. It's catch-22. I mean, a kid could do really well in a continuation setting, and it means nothing if they go back.
So that's a perfect example of the mismatch, also the accountability system. So the credit alignment, as I understand it, is, let's say there's something called Algebra 1, and there are 4 standards you have to hit. In a continuation high school, you get credit for hitting standard 1, and you don't have to revisit that. You get credit for 2. But let's say that you miss 3, you do 4. At the continuation high school, you just need to get that 1 standard to be able to get credit for Algebra 1. If at that point, before you've hit that standard, you move back, that school doesn't have any, the comprehensive school has no way of giving you credit for it. You've got to start over
All
at the
over
bottom.
again.
And so that's the kind of misalignment that needs to be addressed. Otherwise, it's really, I mean, I'd shoot myself.
Yeah.
Any additional questions or comments?
Did you take a look at all at facilities, maintenance, and improvements, things like that within the continuation high schools, and how that would compare to other schools in your district?
Jorge mentioned the word variability, and that hardly captures it. We saw schools that were in trailers at the back of a football field. We saw a school that was in this was in Southern California, in what looked like a closet in a mall. I mean, just horrible on the one end. On the other end, we saw some wonderful facilities, and this really depended on the district. Was the district willing to put money and supports into a pleasant, capacious facility? Kids talked about it, and we're doing a focus group where the kids said, "Well, of course our roofs leak because we're the throwaway kids." They were weird.
Yes, please.
So, I mean, just to comment on that, the Prop 39 money that's going to public schools for energy retrofits offers maybe a path out of that, implementing legislation that Senator De Leon and somebody Skinner are preparing.
The schools also, that's a good suggestion, they also differed a lot in kind of the instructional materials. I mean, some of them on this end, this is the negative end, were all packets. I mean, that's just, you arrive and here's your packet, is one way of dealing with churn, but also lack of instructional materials. The educators who were part of the continuation high schools, the only group I have run into who felt they benefited from No Child Left Behind. Because for the first time, the district had to show that their teachers were accredited. And for the first time, they had to have materials to support their classes. So they felt just materially they were supported by No Child. Ironic.
But that only goes so far. So we visited a school in the first round that had a policy of only having 30 students in continuation at any time. So they had 2 teachers, a math teacher and an English teacher. And the principal of that school said it was his policy to hire only elementary school accredited teachers for his continuation, because he said, my teachers have to teach all the subjects pretty much, and the kids are really kind of they have an elementary school mentality. And so that was his philosophy. I mean, he had a certified teacher in the classroom, but it was an elementary certified school teacher teaching, 18-year-olds. So.
Yeah, in the back.
I have a question. Did you find any schools in your research that were connecting with the Career Tech Ed movement in a district, or was that in discussion at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, we visited Fresno, for example, which made efforts to connect their kids to ROP. And with Clovis also, which sort of connected to the career tech offerings in their district, but they were the exception.
Yeah. It was kind of an end run on the part of a lot of the continuation schools. They would work with the private sector, they would work with community colleges in a way to connect for their kids. I think part of it was a scheduling issue too.
And transportation.
Yeah.
So, of the recommendations that you guys laid out, are there any that you think, if pursued, would have the broadest impact, positive impact for if the state were to make policy changes? What would be some that you think would be the most beneficial? I mean, if you can't do all of them, if there's one or two that would be.
I'd go for a full day.
Full day.
That's
and for me, the identification and placement.
Yeah.
Just because it would create the kind of transparency that would allow grassroots accountability. It would allow parents to say, really, this is how you're identifying and placing kids. So what are services do you have that matches your identification and placement? That would be powerful at the local level, and it would create data at the state level that we could use to generate more accountability.
Well, I would hook that recommendation to strengthening the accountability system more generally. I mean, the placement issues, but also what are the indicators? What's success? Where and how can oversight be carried out?
Okay. Any last questions? I want to thank Jorge and Mildred. And thank you all for coming. I mean, what strikes me in this conversation is that many of the issues that you all are talking about are general to the education system. The accountability system doesn't work very well. The data system doesn't work very well. We have to fix those pieces of the system. But we're talking about the most vulnerable kids in the system, and there is specific policy that really has to attend to them specifically, or their needs will simply not be met.
That's absolutely right. And just to echo Alice's point, these kids truly have no advocates. I mean, think who the system kids are. There's nobody out there kind of saying, what happened in this class, or what's with that grade, or why doesn't there's no voice for them. So absent an accountability system that someone can look at, you could look at and say it's a challenging policy.
So thank you all for coming also. And see you in April.